Hello and welcome to another edition of Deeper, and it is so good to have you with us. It is also a real delight to have Bec. Hello, Bec. How are you doing?
Hello, I'm all right, thank you. How are
Good.
you back from your holidays?
Oh, I was entirely rested until this morning when I looked at my email list, and then yeah, it feels like the holiday's already a long time away. But there it is. That's what holidays are like, isn't it? Um, So if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to watch Beck's sermon on our service online. And it was on humility, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Or gentleness.
Or gentleness or meekness, depending on whichever translation you want to look at. And so Beck looked at a passage, Luke 14, 7 to 14. Um, and we'd love you to read that passage now. So why don't you press pause, read the passage, and maybe even read it in a couple of different versions. It's always good to do that. And then restart the video. Fantastic. Okay, we're going to do what we normally do. We're going to go through it verse by verse first, then we're going to think about some application points and then some questions for you to consider. So here we are. First of all, let's just explain what the context here is, because the verse starts kind of partway through a story, doesn't it? Do you want to explain where the context is, or do you want me to?
No, I can do that.
You do that. Go on, Bec.
Okay, so the context is Jesus has gone to one of the Pharisees' house for a Sabbath day meal. And there's a guy probably hanging around in the courtyard, and Jesus heals him and sort of challenges them as to he's been having this like ongoing discourse with them about healing people on the Sabbath. And so he heals this guy and he says, come on, if your child fell down a well, would you not fish them out because it was the Sabbath? So God cares about his people even on the Sabbath day. And then they go in to sit down for this meal, and he notices the way they're arranging themselves around the table. And I think he wants to continue to sort of challenge them a bit about how they're viewing themselves and how they're viewing other people.
Yeah, good. That's a good summary of the context. Thank you. Uh, and and so we see verse 7, don't we? Straight away, what's going on? He sees what's this kind of toing and froing, this kind of jockeying for position. And you brought this up really well about the culture of the day. Do you want to explain a little bit about that, about the kind of honor and shame thing?
Yeah, so the whole culture of the sort of Roman world at the time was around this idea of honor and shame, and they were arranging themselves constantly. So if you went to an event, you would be arranged by your position in society, and there were things that brought you honor and things that brought you shame, and you were kind of constantly managing your reputation. And sort of trying to improve your position potentially. And I think that's really what Jesus is getting into with them here, is that's not the way of God's kingdom.
Exactly. And it was quite extensive, the whole honor thing. If you if you were honored, it would determine who you could marry, who you could do business with, where you could live, all those kind of things. So it was quite a serious business. If you were low down the pecking order, you would have less opportunity. And it wasn't necessarily about wealth. It was about honor, reputation, all those kind of things. And if you did anything that brought shame on your family, you were already right down the bottom of the list. So there's this kind of constant pecking order going on. People kind of jockeying for position, which is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I'd love to have seen some of that. It feels a little bit alien to us, but it's probably not that alien, and we'll get into that in a minute. We'll get into some of that in a minute. So clearly, people are trying to position themselves. Verse 8, Jesus starts to tell them a parable. So what do you see in verse 8?
He does. Well, I love the way Jesus addresses things with stories, and it's a brilliant sort of Jewish tradition, isn't it? This telling stories and educating each other through stories. So one of the things I noticed was exactly that that being given opportunity to tell stories and to tell your story is a really important part of honouring somebody, isn't it? So Jesus has given some honour in being allowed to sort of question them and tell them a story and listen to what he's got to say. But what strikes me initially is if you've ever tried to arrange some people around a table. So Jesus said, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, don't sit down in the best place. Well, we don't really have that problem anymore, do we? Because that problem is dealt with much earlier on in that terrible day of planning where you have to plan but Jesus sort of starts them off on this, puts them in this place, and sets this scene for them of like, you've been invited. And I think that's what strikes me is, obviously this is a parable, so it's got multiple layers of meaning, but what I spot immediately is you've been invited in the first place, and that's perhaps a particular sort of layer with the Jewish Christians and the non-Jewish Christians, and that sense of these are the people who God is inviting into this party. There's loads and loads of parties in Luke, isn't there? It's quite a theme for him about what the kingdom looks like.
Indeed. That in itself is a parable for the kingdom, isn't it? And it's really interesting, I think, that Jesus talks about, of all the feasts he could talk about, he talks about a wedding feast, which, for us, we know that, that the whole kind of heaven is described as the wedding feast of the Lamb. So there's something here, I think, about the bigger context. It's not just about honor and shame. He's saying something bigger here. You've been invited. What to? Well, you've been invited to eternity with God. That's what you've been invited to. And I think there's probably, as we look on, there's a bit of a dig at the Pharisees, because the Pharisees always, we see it constantly. They were probably the most zealous people for God amongst their peers, but that brought with it a whole bunch of arrogance and kind of misinformation and slight twisting of scriptures and all those kind of things. But I think he's probably having a go, and he's having a little dig at the Pharisees. Everyone's been invited to the wedding feast, and all you're worried about is honor and shame and seeing yourselves as above other people. So what we see here is, you've been invited, and he says, do not take the place of honor, because some more distinguished may also have been invited. So don't kind of put yourself too high up, which all sounds very kind of common sense, doesn't it? And then he says in verse 9, because the host may ask you to go and sit in the lower place, and so that would bring shame. And who wants that? Who wants to be put in the worst place? Is there anything that you see in verse 9 here that strikes you?
So, I mean, it's good common sense, isn't it? This sort of, don't put yourself too high up, you might get busted down. In this society, this was good common sense advice. It echoes some stuff from Proverbs. It echoes sort of just social etiquette of the time. But it's interesting. I said this on Sunday, the cross, it almost sounds like Jesus is affirming this approach, isn't it? Measure yourself up, get good at knowing where you sit, and make sure you don't sit yourself too high up. If you need to sit lower down, it's better that than it sort of sounds all very practical, but like you say, there's this underlying meaning of like not seeing yourself, not trying to put yourself too high up, not trying to jostle for position.
I think it comes back to what you said before about layers of meaning. There is this kind of very common sense thing about when you go to a party, do this. But when you throw in it, this is Jesus teaching, and he might be teaching about kind of the kingdom of God, that he's saying something else here, isn't he? He's saying, basically saying, don't be spiritually arrogant. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. it kind of corresponds with a lot of things both he and Paul and Peter say.
It really strikes me here that the hosts invited both of you as well. That sort of, with that double layer on,
Yeah.
you know, that it's God is inviting these other people into this. It's not yours to choose who comes and who doesn't.
Yeah.
But there's this host in the mix as well.
That's right. And then in verse 10, Jesus says, take the lowest place, because then you might be invited to a higher position, which is the kind of the counterpoint to what he says. In other words, don't exalt yourself. Let others exalt you. Let other people do the work of that. And then verse 11, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. What do you see there?
It's this whole paradoxical idea of the kingdom of heaven, isn't it? That the first will be last and the last will be first. And I think what it offers us as well is a way to live peacefully, because there's no need to fight for your position if you will just do what's in front of you, sit where you find yourself, then you will find yourself moved up. God will honor you. God will give you position and place that's right, without all the striving of trying to get yourself somewhere that maybe isn't God's plan for you.
Indeed. And you kind of answered the question there, because that I had in my mind when I first read it. It's like, well, who does the exalting? Are we counting on other people to do it? But in the kingdom of God, it's God who exalts, isn't it? And I came across a verse in Psalm 75 where it says, it is God who judges. He brings one down and he exalts another. And in the end, when we face judgment, we'll kind of all know where we stand. We're either with the sheep or we're with the goats. We're in or we're out, and it'll all be as simple as that in the end. And then Jesus changes tack, because this actually, the 12 to 14 is the second parable, and then there's a third one after this, isn't it, which says a very similar thing. So let's treat 12 to 14 as a kind of lump. So what do you see in here?
This is really interesting to me. So he sort of switches, doesn't he, from you've been invited to something and this is how you behave, to you, there's an onus on you to invite. And if we think about this missionally, who do we sort of relate with, and how do we sit with people the way Jesus would sit with them, sort of making people comfortable and being comfortable around all kinds of different people. I think there's a real risk in the church, isn't there, that we only invite people who are like us, and we can only imagine people who are like us being able to take their place. And it's a really interesting challenge when we think about it that way. I don't think Jesus is saying you shouldn't ever eat with your friends and family, because I think Jesus did quite a lot of that, but I think it's more about being able to welcome whoever God puts in your path.
Yeah. I hadn't noticed that. It goes from being invited to inviting. I hadn't noticed that. That's a really good point. I mean, just thinking about it, there is something about if we understand ourselves properly and understand our sinfulness, if you've been invited as a sinful person, then you should be open to inviting everyone along to the kingdom of God, because if you're invited, they deserve to be invited too, whoever they are. But yeah, that's a really good point. And there's a whole thing here, isn't there, about not doing things simply for selfish gain. It's because if you invite the poor, they can't repay you. You invite your friends and family, you kind of expect an invitation back. So I mean, Andrew and I have had this conversation loads of times with friends. Should we invite so and so for a meal? We haven't seen them for a couple of years, and it's like Andrew might say, well, we had them here last time. They haven't invited us since. And it's like, well, what do you do with that? Do you take that as a snub? Or have they just forgotten? Or do you act graciously? And of course, we always try to act graciously. most of the time. But there's a kind of reciprocal thing that you expect, isn't it? That, you know, if you invite someone, that they might invite you back, and you can, and people use that to their advantage in some ways.
And again, thinking a bit about that as us as church, you know, if we invite all people who we think we can create a very jolly community with and have a really happy time with, but we don't invite anyone who challenges us or who's not necessarily going to be able to contribute a great deal to our life as a community, but who we might be a real blessing to, that isn't the way that Jesus is talking here, is it?
Right.
It's about opening ourselves up to people who we might not expect very much back from, in lots of different ways.
Absolutely. And when you look at, you know, the people he's talking about here, you know, the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, they were people who certainly in that context contributed very little to life generally. They were people who relied on others to be fed, to be looked after, to be cared for, you know, much more so than today, where, you know, people with various disabilities or issues can live self-sufficient lives. It's not that way in Jesus' time. So, you know, these are people who truly couldn't pay you back in any kind of way at all. You are simply giving for giving's sake.
Yeah, and potentially that association issue of you might do their social standing a great deal of good, but they might do yours some damage, and there's some risk taking, isn't there, in opening ourselves up to. Yeah,
that's right. And yeah, I think for us today, it's certainly important that we don't take what Jesus says, you know, the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, too literally, because he's talking simply about people who are being shunned. And in our day, that can be very different. You know, you can be talking about people with mental health problems or who have their own reputation issues. You know, there's all sorts of reasons why people may get shunned. And we're to be as open to inviting them as anyone else. And then it finishes with, although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So it's not that you don't get anything back, it's just not in this life. At some point, you reap the reward of what you've done.
Yeah, and reap the reward, you know, well, I think there's something now about reaping the reward of a richness of community. If you're sharing your life with all different kinds of people from different backgrounds who have different life experiences to offer. But also that's what we're hoping for in the kingdom, isn't it? That it's going to be a really rich community around worship of God. And so that's, there'll be something about that in the reward, I think, that we'll have this more fully represented humanity by having people who are different to us, who are a challenge to us.
Yeah. And I love that the context of all of this is effectively a party. And you'd want to enjoy yourself at a party, wouldn't you? You know, if you're not enjoying yourself, it's not much of a party. And I think the idea comes across here is that no matter who you are with, whether it's the least of the least, enjoy being there. If you are sat in the lowest place, enjoy being there. Because, I don't know about you, but if I was sat in the lowest place and I'd been placed there, I would have a gob on me. I'd be like, I'd be miserable all night. But there's something here about Jesus saying, be content in those places, enjoy being in those places. Because if it's a party, you're meant to have fun. And there's something I think we can all learn from that, isn't it? About finding enjoyment and joy and fun in all sorts of different contexts, not just with the people that we like.
Yeah.
Let's move on to just thinking out some of the applications of this by going a little bit wider. So here we are. Let's think about some of the application points. Where do you want to start, Bec? What would you like to start with?
So I think one of the really important themes in the passage is around being able to be comfortable in different situations and with different kinds of people who are like us and people who are quite different to us. And I wonder how we can sort of um, grow ourselves to be like those warm people that I talked about, that can accept and welcome anybody and make a place for anybody in any situation.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, you talked on Sunday about not wanting to be cool, because you'll be cool when you're dead. I like that. I don't know where the quote came from, but I like that quote. But being warm is completely different. It's about an openness to people, to all people, which I really liked. And I think kind of alongside that as well, that there's a thing about not comparing ourselves. You know, we talk about comparison being a kind of modern problem because of the whole social media thing. We are constantly comparing our lives, what other people are doing. You see it on TV, all that kind of stuff. And yet, here in Jesus' day, that's exactly what they're doing. They're comparing themselves, not necessarily their lives, but themselves with other people, and creating a pecking order. And in the kingdom of God, we need to be beyond that. We need to move way beyond that, because we should see ourselves as all people who have fallen short, who are in need of God, need of his grace, need of his love. We are all the same in that way. So I think there's something there about us not comparing ourselves.
Yeah, and the incredible freedom that comes from not having those comparisons
Yeah,
in your mind does free you up to love people more fully, doesn't it? Because you're not trying to go, well, how could I get that position?
yeah, yeah. And if you're comparing yourself all the time, it leads to discontent.
Yeah,
Because there's always someone in a better place than you, always, and what you never see are those in a worse place than you. I mean, people who are really stuck in the comparison never see those things. They go onto social media and they skip over the negative posts and only focus on those posts where people are doing incredible things on incredible holidays, or just got an incredible kitchen, or all that kind of stuff, and wish they were like that.
yeah.
That are realizing their life is already so much better than the vast majority of other people's lives. So I think there is something there about comparison. I think for me, there's another point in that Jesus is speaking specifically to the Pharisees, who were incredibly zealous for God, but become arrogant with it. And I think there's a danger for all of us who, unless we're careful, can become spiritually arrogant. You quite often see it with young Christians. They especially, it depends on how they've come to faith, but they get to know Jesus and they're flying and looking at the church and saying, "There's so much wrong with the church. I'll make it better," or looking at non-Christians and saying how bad their lives are and all that kind of stuff. We can become quite conceited if we're not careful. And for me, what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees is trying to just say, it's what Paul says in Romans 12, look at yourself with sober judgment,
Yeah.
and you brought that out on Sunday, didn't you? It's not about you're worse than everyone else and you're not better than everyone else. You see yourself with sober judgment, understand your weaknesses, understand your strengths, and live with that, and try and work with that.
I think sometimes we can get really, we don't like to focus too much on sin, do we? And particularly in our tradition, one of the things I've loved learning from my Anglo-Catholic brothers and sisters is that they're quite good at going, actually, I'm not brilliant. I'm not brilliant, and I get loads of things wrong. And I think when we find ourselves getting a bit spiritually arrogant, that's quite a good way to redress that, is to make ourselves a bit aware of how often do I really need to be fished out of my messes by Jesus? How often do I say the wrong thing or mess it up, or
I think that brings it to the last point is, if we're going to compare ourselves with anyone, we need to compare ourselves with Jesus. He's the only one that we should compare ourselves with. And we'll always fall short of Jesus, but he provides the model that we aspire to.
Yeah.
When it comes to humility, he is the epitome of humility. Here he is, the Son of God on a cross for us, dying for our sin. And I mean, I always love Philippians chapter 2. It's a great poetic, magnificent passage that talks about the humility of Christ. And in 2:5 it says, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality of God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And that to me is a description of humility. The most highest being in all of the universe and all of creation and beyond, and yet he takes the form of a servant. And this whole idea of humility is about being Christ-like. So let's think of some questions for people to consider. So we're going to think now about some questions for you to consider, either in your groups or on your own. Do you want to start, Bec?
So this one will probably be a bit more fun if you are in a group, but we talked a little bit earlier, I talked a bit earlier about the infamous seating plan. And I wondered whether you have any funny experiences of trying to create a seating plan, maybe when you were hosting a party or a wedding or something, or whether you found yourself sat on a particularly interesting table at an event that you would love to share with each other and laugh and share those experiences together.
Yeah, and when that goes wrong, it can go badly wrong, can't it? So yeah, that's a great question. I've also got a question that's a little bit more of a kind of sharing, using your imagination type of question. Where did Jesus sit at this table? It doesn't say in the passage. And it's just interesting to kind of think, well, where did the host place him? Did Jesus deliberately sit at one end? Where was he in the pecking order?
Where do you sit after you've told that story?
Yeah, he's telling a story. I mean, if he'd placed himself at the top, it wouldn't look good, would it? So just kind of use your imagination and reflect on what's going on here and ask the question, where did Jesus sit? Next question, Bec.
Okay, so who do you find yourself most comfortable with? And who do you find yourself least comfortable with? Who do you find it a bit of a challenge maybe to have sort of relaxed conversation with? Or I suppose think about how you might practice stepping into your challenge zone in the next week or two. How can you sort of set up an opportunity to make yourself more comfortable around people who you might find difficult?
When you say who, you're not talking about necessarily, it might be, but not necessarily specific people, but maybe types of people.
Types of people, yeah. So if you're not normally somebody who would speak with children or young people very comfortably, you might want to take an opportunity to just have a short interaction with somebody. Not have to invite them around for a dinner party, just to think about how you express that welcome that Jesus offered to everybody, to people who maybe you wouldn't naturally do that with.
Good, okay. I suppose my question kind of bounces off that a little bit as well. And it's about how do you avoid comparing yourself with others? Because if you're constantly in a place where you're challenging yourself to be with people who aren't like you, you will compare yourself. So how do you avoid that? How can you become more content with who you are, who God has created you to be? And a final question, look at verse 13. What does that look like in your life? Who should you be inviting for a meal or for a coffee? People who you just don't normally associate with, or perhaps who are shunned by others. Who could you invite? Fantastic. So it's been so good to have everyone with us today. And Bec, it's been lovely to have a chat with you again. Do please join us for Sunday with the final in our sermon series called Bear Fruit. We are looking at self-control. And of course, join us next Tuesday for another edition of Deeper. Until then, take care. Goodbye.